All right, cool. We're here for another episode of Touchlab Share. We're joined by Malvin from Wantedly, and we're really excited to kind of talk about his experience, the organization's experience, kind of originally investigating cross-platform, going down a path with React Native, figuring that wasn't the best path for them, and then ultimately landing on Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile. So it's a great story, and I think there's a lot of great lessons here for teams that are in the compare phase where they're interested in finding a cross-platform technology and deciding on which path to go. So there'll be plenty of insights there. I think it'd be great, Malvin, if you can just kind of give an introduction on yourself, and then we can kind of start from there.
Hi everyone, I'm a software engineer at Wantedly, where we are based in Tokyo, Japan. So let me introduce Wantedly quite a bit. So Wantedly is like a social recruiting service where users on our platform can connect with other users, and they can also apply for jobs from companies that are listed in our platform. So our aim is to match people based on their passion and cultures and the work environment that they want to work with. So we allow our users to ask for a casual meeting with a company before they decide whether they want to apply for that company or not. And we are available in 3 countries, in Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And in terms of mobile apps, we have 2 main apps, the Wantedly Visit and Wantedly People. The users of Wantedly Visits can apply for jobs and, as I mentioned before, ask for casual meetings with companies. And for users of Wantedly People, they can manage their connections with other users and also manage their profile. So I myself am working in the Wantedly Visit Android and iOS apps, and recently in the Kotlin Multiplatform sites.
Awesome. One of the things that I wanted to I think is important to kind of talk about early on is what is like the size and makeup of your mobile team? Can you just kind of give us a little bit of some background there?
I think in terms of size, I can say that we are on a smaller side we only have 4 engineers across both iOS and Android for the Visit platform, and then 2 engineers in the People platform.
I got it. So a pretty concentrated team, and I'm sure there's a lot of requests that are coming to your team in terms of features, maintenance. In the article that you put out on Medium, right, moving from React Native to Kotlin Multiplatform, engineering acceleration was a driving force behind the team's search into cross-platform and then into React Native originally. Can you talk a little bit about the motivation to look into cross-platform, right? Like what type of acceleration goals and objectives were you trying to meet?
Maybe let me explain why, like our motivation to start adopting React Native. So when we decided to adopt React Native is because we were a very small team, I mentioned before. So we had a lot of features that we want to develop. And then we also wanted to do a renewal on the iOS apps. And because a lot of the engineers will be spent on mobile engineers, energy will be spent on doing the renewals. So a lot of the feature development got stopped. So we tried to borrow the engineers from the web team to develop features for the iOS apps. And because the web teams are familiar with React, so we decided to work with React Native. And with React Native, we can do the feature development and renewals in parallel.
Got it. Yeah, that makes total sense, right? Using existing resources on a team and using a framework that they're already kind of familiar with and then expanding it to mobile. What went wrong with React Native? Let's talk about that.
Let me preface this by saying that these issues with React Native are very specific to our team. Like this is not issues that represents React Native as a platform or as a technologies. Like one of the issues with React Native for our team is that because the web engineers, after they implemented the features for the mobile app, they went back to develop features for the web. So we didn't have any active maintainers for the React Native parts of the mobile apps. So a lot of the tools and the React Native version itself are very outdated. And also another issue with React Native is that it's a completely separate toolchain from the mobile apps. So it will add a lot of like build time to your build process, especially in iOS and Android. I think we have about like an extra 7 to 8 minutes of build time in CI/CD pipeline. And also because React Native is a very different technology stack, like the engineers from the mobile team cannot like transfer easily from mobile to web development. And there are also like small UI and UX differences. For example, with React Native, some components works really well in iOS, but once they were ported to Android, they didn't work really well, or they have like a very bad performance.
Yeah, no, I think that's a major point, that you're kind of managing a third platform, and then when I guess when some of the velocity that's required on the teams dies down a bit, and people can kind of go back to focusing on their, the web engineers can go back to the web, the mobile engineers can focus on the mobile. There's still that React Native code that the mobile engineers are going to have to interface with. What were some of the decision factors that made you said, you know what, we're going to move away from React Native and move to Kotlin Multiplatform? What were some of the decision factors there?
One of the biggest decision factors, I think, is like the maintainability of React Native. As we mentioned before, because it's a different technology stacks, like engineers for mobile engineers doesn't really necessarily easily move to web development. So a lot of the features got very outdated, and we tried to update the React Native implementation. But of course, a lot of issues with the toolings, and like whenever we wanted to update Xcode or Android Studio Gradle plugins, and we got errors with React Native toolings. That's why we said, okay, maybe React Native is not very maintainable. Maybe we want to explore other technologies, or maybe we just re-implement everything back in native. That's when we decided to explore other solutions for cross-platform.
And then do you remember kind of like what caught your eye initially about Kotlin Multiplatform? How did your interest develop there?
The interest in Kotlin multi-platform was the announcement of that Kotlin was going to into multi-platform, and then you can compile Kotlin code to Kotlin native and then share it with iOS. And that's what caught our eye. And then because the timing was just right, that Kotlin announced the new multi-platform efforts, and then we also exploring to drop React Native altogether, and then it's a very well timed.
Perfect. And what would you say were some of the key decision criteria, right? When the timing is perfect, you hear about this thing that makes sense. What were some of the things that you looked at that made you decide that Kotlin Multiplatform was a good path forward?
One of the things that we looked at was that we definitely want to share code between the platforms, because as I mentioned before, we are a very small team, so code reuse is very important part. We don't want to re-implement like duplicate codes, or we don't want to implement duplicate codes such as like network calls, like database access, and so on and so forth. And we want to make these API calls and database serializations and whatnot to be consistent across both platforms. Because even if you implement everything on native levels, there will be small differences between each platform, like how you handle nullables, how you handle errors from the servers. And we want to make it consistent and make it shareable. And also we want to make use of the native UI elements as much as possible. Because as I mentioned before, with React Native, we encountered issues with like bad performance on the UI components. That's why we want to implement the UI this time in native UI components.
It sounds like a lot of the things that Kotlin Multiplatform is known for were things that were important to you and the team. So it sounded like it was just like a perfect fit, which is great.
It's a perfect fit.
Yeah, that's great. And in terms of like the team, right? Like, you were excited about it. I think that several other people on your team were excited about it. Is there anything you can share to like other developers that are excited about Kotlin Multiplatform? How do you get management? How do you get your peers kind of brought in? Anything that worked well for you?
One of the reasons that we were able to convince the management level to adopt multi-platform was that because Kotlin multi-platform is written in Kotlin. Even if this technology fails in the future, I'm not saying it will, but with Kotlin multi-platform, because the code is written in Kotlin, you can actually take the Kotlin multi-platform code back into Android, even if the Kotlin multi-platform fails. And then you just redevelop only the iOS parts. Whereas with other cross-platform technologies, you will end up having to re-implement everything back in Android and iOS.
That's exactly what, we had another one of these sessions yesterday with a mobile team in Europe. And exactly what said, right? At the end of the day, you have a world-class code for Android. And then on the iOS side, it's recoverable risk, right? It's like, it's risk that You can scale it back. It's not going to be the end of the world. You don't have to do a complete rewrite. So great to hear you talk about that as well. Let's talk a little bit about your particular configuration. What's your configuration like? Like what's in your KMP that's in production right now?
So for Kotlin Multiplatform, we share a component called a reactor. So reactor is a unidirectional pattern for managing UI states. So a reactor can receive an input in terms of actions. An example of actions will be like whether a user apply for a job. And then you send a user apply action to the reactor. And then a reactor can emit view states. An example of states in whether a button is visible. What do you want to display to the users, or like a list of jobs to be displayed to the users. The reactor will interact with repository classes. The repository classes are responsible for fetching the data from the network APIs and then store it in the database. Our iOS and Android code only interacts with Reactor, and everything underneath the Reactor are shared with Kotlin Multiplatform.
And what was that process like, right? It sounds like a really smart solution to something that you wanted to accomplish. What was the development of that solution like? Did it come easily? Did you rely on kind of open source libraries out there? Anything you can share in terms of like how you landed on that particular configuration?
So we based our Reactor on Reactor Kit, which is an open source library for iOS to manage UI view states. The reason we implement Reactor Kit or Reactor Kit like in Kotlin Multiplatform was because during the renewal of our iOS apps, we made use of the Reactor Kit. And because we found that it's a very useful pattern, we also implemented something similar in Android with Android view models. Now, because both the Android and iOS now have this same pattern of Reactor-like implementation, it's very easy for us to transfer that implementation into the Kotlin Multiplatform side. And now the users or the iOS code and Android code will look into Reactor, which has the same pattern with what we have right now.
That makes total sense. And I think what's so cool about this, right, is you guys were probably solving problems for the first time because it's such a new framework, right? And your use case at Wantedly is so unique to your organization. So when we talk to teams that are putting KaMP Multiplatform into production, we tell them like, hey, congrats, because you probably figured out a couple of things that no one else in the world has. You referenced KaMP Kit, right? We have a startup project that's called KaMP Kit. You referenced that particular project that we put out in your article. How did KaMP Kit help your goal of putting Kotlin Multiplatform into production?
Okay, when we first started exploring Kotlin Multiplatform, there weren't many tutorials or guides to set up Kotlin Multiplatform. And then we found KaMP Kit from the KMM showcase side. KaMP Kit provides us with the templates necessary for us to build a working setup so that we can easily write Kotlin Multiplatform codes, because it takes all the hard task of implementing or setting up your Kotlin Multiplatform codes. And also, KaMP Kit provides us with a few libraries that you can use for implementing Kotlin Multiplatform codes, like SQLite or the Atomic Boolean or Stately. And also, it provides you with some workarounds. For example, with KaMP Kit, it provides us with workaround to write tests for both Android and iOS platform.
I have to ask, would you recommend KaMP Kit by Touchlab for folks that are starting their exploration of KMM?
Easily, definitely use KaMP Kit. It's very easy to use, and it gets you up and running really fast.
Thank you for that, Melvin. Looking back, right, at your journey with Kotlin Multiplatform, what are some of the biggest lessons you learned in this implementation?
I think one of the biggest learnings that we have was that writing Kotlin Multiplatform is not the same with Kotlin in JVM and Android. You will notice that there are classes that are not available in Kotlin native. One of them is reflections. And also, even though like iOS, Swift, and Android Kotlin are very different, they are also very similar. Like we talked to iOS engineers about what's their opinion with our implementation of Reactor and stuff. And generally their opinion is that even though this is written in Kotlin, it's not Android. You're only managing UI states that they are easily understandable even by iOS engineers, and they can even easily contribute to the implementation. And sharing code between Android and iOS is very beneficial if you are a very small team, because it tremendously helps with your velocity in implementing new features. And also with Kotlin Multiplatform, like the pace of new bug fixes and announcements, roadmaps gives us like a very nice idea of like how Kotlin Multiplatform will evolve in the future.
Do you feel like you know what to expect on the road? I want to go back to what you just said in terms of the increase in velocity. How have your business stakeholders, whether it's your product team, whether it's your management, what has been their reaction to this increase in velocity that your team, your small but very strong team, has been able to produce? What has been the reaction from the business side?
Very excited. Like, we showed them that we can implement a screen in iOS that usually took about 2 to 3 days easily in like an hour or two, because we reuse all the components from the Kotlin multi-platform, and all the UI states, all the database handling, error handlings are already been handled by the Kotlin multi-platform.
It's like you're putting something into production that has already been tested, kind of
Yes.
out. Okay, interesting. And what's the current status of the Kotlin multi-platform implementation at the moment? Still in production? Is it plans to expand? Can you talk to us about that?
For our Android apps, we have about 8 to 10 screens. They are currently using Kotlin multi-platform, and we are definitely expanding it to other parts of the app as well. Whereas for iOS, we actually submitted our implementation of Kotlin multi-platform yesterday, and it should be live in like a week or so. And actually, we are also looking into sharing our Kotlin multi-platform code with the people team. So we are going to create something that will be shared for other apps. It's going to be very exciting.
No, congrats on that, because like the first time kind of seeing Kotlin multi-platform on the iOS side is a very exciting moment. I know when our team was doing like research and development, and the first time we got something running on iOS, it was like, oh, this is really working. This is a
works very smoothly. It just works.
Yeah, it just works. Great. And I'm glad your other engineering team is also looking at this, because we definitely see that. One of our clients is now expanding their Kotlin multi-platform utilization from one team to another team, because they kind of heard about it, right? They saw Touchlab share on that particular successful project, and then the team's like, all right, what is this? And you kind of start talking back to each other. So I'm glad KaMP is expanding at Wantedly. You have the benefit of hearing about Kotlin multi-platform, exploring it, and ultimately putting it in production into Android. iOS is going to be approved soon, right? If a team is interested in the value proposition of Kotlin multi-platform, what are some of your recommendations for how they should go about exploring this?
I will definitely recommend them to start like creating small prototypes in a separate project and see how the Kotlin code interacts with Kotlin Android and iOS Swift, and then assess the potential that way. You may want to look at the classes and functions and callbacks when looking at the code from when it's invoked from Swift and from Android. And also you want to look at other open source repositories like People in Space by John O'Reilly.
I think that's great. Starting small,
yes.
Value of it very quickly, and then I think you can kind of go from there. But it's really seeing it work that I think a lot of the folks that we talk to that have put it into production, it's definitely their recommendation.
Yeah, definitely include the iOS engineers when you're assessing the Kotlin code interop with Swift.
Let's talk a little bit about your project structure. From what I understand, you have a separate repository for Android and iOS.
Yeah.
And that's pretty unique to you. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So if you're following the Kotlin multi-platform for mobile sample, you will have your project or you'll have your Android, iOS, and Kotlin Multiplatform inside a single repository. But when you introduce Kotlin Multiplatform into an existing code, it will most likely that your iOS and Android already exist in a separate repository. So for us, we introduce Kotlin Multiplatform as a separate repository and then distribute it to Android and iOS. Like for Android, you can do it easily by using Maven, and then you download the dependencies that way. It's very straightforward. But for iOS, there are several ways that you can consume Kotlin multi-platform code. The configuration that we ended up with is that we created a Git submodules inside our iOS repository. And then inside this Git submodule is the Kotlin multi-platform code, including the podspec file. This podspec file then you will add into your iOS pod files, which will then trigger the build for Kotlin multi-platform code. And that's how you can consume KMM code from the iOS.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a big part of the story, because folks are always kind of looking for unique approaches.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they'll value that approach as well. Well, look, Malvin, I really want to thank you for your time. This was amazing.
Thank you. I am sure I made a lot of mistakes, but
no, you were great. I think the value of this, right? We hear this from our audience a lot, is hearing from teams that have put this into production is a huge confidence boost to developers, managers that are seeing Kotlin multi-platform mobile. They like what they see, but they want to hear the stories of people that have, put it into production. So your insight, your team's insight, again, congratulations. And thank you so much for jumping on this episode of Touchlab Share. Any parting words around Kotlin multi-platform? Any last minute advice you want to give to the folks listening?
Definitely explore multi-platform if you are looking to share code between teams. Like I have never seen anything better than Kotlin multi-platform. There
you have it. Malvin, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be in touch soon, all right?
Thank you.
Yep.
All right.